Hi guys, thanks for helping me reach 100 subscribers. I didn't actually think I'd get this far, but I couldn't have done it without all of your help. If you're not currently subscribed to my channel, you might want to consider it. It encourages me to make some more content. And speaking of which, I think I might try a weekly release schedule for this summer. Okay, so today's tutorial is going to be about fireworks. Now, I'm going to be using the Blender 2.8 release candidate, but I'll be working in cycles, so you could theoretically do this in like Blender 2.76 or whatever. I suggest you update. There's no reason not to, and Blender 2.8 is pretty exciting. Hopefully it comes out soon. Anyways, let's get started. So first, make sure your render engine is on cycles, and we need this for one important reason, which we'll get to later. The first thing we want to do is make an emitter object for our fireworks. So we'll rename this, and we'll duplicate it to make our actual sparks. And we'll start by giving this a material. You can name these things whatever you want, actually. It doesn't really matter. And we'll just leave this as something basic for now. You don't need to change any of these settings. Alright, so now to create fireworks in Blender, the most obvious way is with the particle system. So you want to go to this tab. It'll look different if you're using an older version of Blender, but it's particle systems. So you want to make a new particle system, and you can play it right now and see what it looks like. So neither Cycles nor Eevee renders these particles right now. They're technically halo particles, as we see here, but we can't render them. So what we have to do is change them to render our object. Oh, and if you need proof of that, you can see right now none of these particles are being rendered. So we need to render as an object instead. And now we can see them. That doesn't look very much like fireworks at all right now. So we're going to have to make a couple tweaks. So first, we can increase the scale a little bit. And we might want to move this up. And we'll reposition the camera later. So we'll set the scale to something reasonable, and you want to turn up scale randomness all the way up. Just makes it look a little better. Now, fireworks are a short burst, so we want to constrain this to maybe 2 frames, say. It doesn't matter which 2 frames you pick, but just make an interval. I'm just going to go from frame 35 to 37. And so we'll see a burst instead of continual output. This number of particles is fine for me. If you have a lot of computing power for some reason and you don't mind burning it, you could set this to like 10,000. I'm going to leave it as it is. We want to change the lifetime randomness as well, so they don't all disappear at once, because that looks a little bit unrealistic. And since my particle system's going to pretty much disappear after frame 88, we'll just stop the whole animation at frame 90, because otherwise it'd be kind of a waste. Okay, great. Now, since these are thrown out with black powder, we want to increase the velocity that the particles come out with. So it looks like that. And we can reduce the gravity. So we have a little bit of a bigger explosion. You can delete this light, we're not going to use it. The scene I'm going to set up is going to be pretty simple. We're going to go to the World tab, and we're going to turn down the brightness. And we don't want this big emitter to be shown, so what we need to do is go to the viewport display and click show emitter, and it's not going to appear in our final render. We also don't want to see this spark object, which all of these other things are, so we're going to just hide it here. And we're going to make sure it doesn't get rendered. Or alternatively, you could just move it somewhere outside of your camera view. And okay, so let's reposition the camera right now. Let's go from a lower facing angle, and you can use your mouse wheel, just press down and rotate the view. And then to focus the camera on here, you can press Ctrl Alt 0. Move it on the Z-axis by grabbing it with G and then moving it down, locking it on the Z-axis by pressing Z. I've done that. Okay, that's weird. It's rendering both of them. Okay, so what we're gonna have to do is just move this out of the scene. So just press G, grab it, and move it somewhere else. And this particle system. Okay, so it's not in the viewport display. That'll remove it in the viewport. You also need to uncheck it. Uncheck show emitter in the render panel. And it's not showing up anymore, which is great. Now to hide this, if you're in an older version of Blender, there used to be like a camera next to these eyes, which could hide it in the render, but I'm not too familiar with Blender 2.8, so I'm just going to move it out of the scene. It doesn't really make any difference. It's just a little cleaner, more professional if you just hide it. But I don't know how to do that, so we're going to leave it for now. Okay, great. So now, another thing we can do is we can use the new particle instance. So we need to apply this. We don't apply this with the particle system. We apply it to the object we're making an instance of. And this is going to be a little bit recursive because we're going to be, well, you'll see. Make sure you check both children and size here. Okay, so you can see what happens with this enabled. So now where each of those individual particles were, now we get another cloud of smaller particles, which are basically duplicates of the original particle system, which is pretty cool actually. Now we got a more like confetti looking thing, but the problem is now we've got like 100 times more particles, so if you're trying to run this on a slow laptop, it might not work very well. We can also uncheck these two. We don't really need to show the particles when they're unborn or dead. And you don't need to change any other settings. Okay, so now let's fix this material. So this is the reason why we have to use cycles. So first we need to attach a particle info node, which will let us alter some of the values for the emission, for the color and the strength of the emission. So the problem is that this node isn't currently supported in Eevee, which is why we're not using Eevee. If you don't care, you could render in Eevee like right now and it wouldn't make any difference, but I promise this will look cool. So we kind of had to use cycles. Next we need to add a math node. And okay, so I'll get into the logic of this right now. So you need to plug in the age and the lifetime into this node, and we need to change it to divide. And then we're going to add a color ramp, and we're going to tweak these colors. So you'll want to have the lighter color on this side. So let's try to figure out what's happening here. So if you know how to program, this might come a bit easier for you, but the idea is that we're going to toggle where this is, or where our color is. So our color is picked, imagine like a slider in the middle of this, and we're moving it back and forth. And again, we have this position being 0 and this position being 1, as you can see here. And this factor determines where that slider is. So what we're doing is, so we're taking the age and we're dividing it by the lifetime. So let's say the lifetime is 50 frames for a certain particle. And we're going to spawn it on frame 0. So at the 0th frame, we're going to take the age, which is 0, because it's only been alive for that one frame, and the lifetime, which is 50, and divide them. So we get 0 divided by 50 is 0, which sets this factor input to 0. So that means our invisible slider is going to be on this side, and we're going to be moving it over to this side. So when it gets to frame 25, that slider is going to be here, so the color will be like that. And when we get to frame 50, the position of the slider will be 1, because it'll be 50 divided by 50, so we're going to end up on this side. And we can do the same thing with the strength, so we can take this output and we can put it here. But we don't want the strength to start off at 1 and fade to 0, because it's going to look kind of mushy. I don't know the word for this. So what we're going to have to do is add another math node, or we can actually just duplicate this one. And okay, so right now the number that we're getting is anything from 1 to 0 for the strength, which is not what we want. So we're going to increase that by a little. So we're going to multiply that by 5. So now we get a number from 5 to 0, and everything's going to be a lot brighter, which is important when we use the glow node. And then let's add 1. So that means now instead of being from 0 to 4.999, we're going to get a number between 1 and 5999. So our strength is always going to be greater than 1. And this is already starting to look pretty cool. Now, the next thing we can add is some effects, which is pretty much all we have left, actually. Right, okay, so we'll start with some motion blur. Now, if we were to use Eevee for this, it wouldn't work, because Eevee doesn't currently support object motion blur. Like, if you have a moving cube or whatever going from this side of the screen to that side, you wouldn't actually be able to tell it wouldn't apply any motion blur. It only has camera motion blur, like if you rotate the camera or whatever. Cycles has had motion blur for a long time, both for the object and the camera, so that's another reason why we're going to stick with it. So the position doesn't really matter. Actually, we kind of want to change it to end on frame, and we'll set the shutter speed to 2. So a longer shutter speed is going to be a longer motion blur, and we want to change the shutter curve. So we're going to change it into this sort of, I think this is called a right bias. Anyways, we're going to change this into a sort of upwards facing ramp. So this is going to be where the motion blur is least intense, and this is where it's going to be the most intense. So we're going to see, like, it's going to look kind of like a comet tail. And we need to set the shutter sort of high, because these particles aren't moving super fast. And let's take a look at how this is going to render. Now, what you can do, if you wanted to, you could set the shutter super high and they would have really long trails, and that might look cool, but the problem is that these motion blurs don't really get curved, and these particles aren't moving in a straight line, they're moving on an arc. So it's going to look kind of fuzzy, and I might attach a video at the end of showing you what that looks like, because it does not look very good. Okay, so this is what we have right now. I want to change the background a little bit brighter, maybe tinge it with glue. Okay, so we can do some compositing too. I think depth of field would work pretty well here. You could even animate it, but I'm not going to do that in this video. So we need to check in the camera settings the depth of field, and we can set the focus object to this emitter. And you can click the eyedropper and click your emitter, and you'll see it set there. And then what we want to do We want to see what it looks like first of all. So we add filter, defocus. Make sure you plug in the depth to the Z node so you know, so Blender is taking into account how far the particles actually are. Click use Z buffer, and preview makes stuff render faster, but it looks bad, so you want to uncheck that. You can check gamma correction. It doesn't really do much. And so the lower the f-stop, the more defocused your camera gets. So if I turned it down to 6 or something, you wouldn't be able to see it too clearly. If you turned it down to 2, it would turn into fuzziness. You might think that looks good. I can try rendering this with multiple different defocus settings, or you could actually just animate this by hitting I. Okay, so let's do that. So we'll start at frame 32. Let the f-stop to like 1. Hit I. And we're going to go to frame 50, I don't know, just pick a random frame, something further along, and we'll set the f-stop to 20. Hit I again, and you'll see that turns yellow to show that it's keyframed, and you can scroll along this timeline to see how this f-stop number changes. Okay, great. So now we need to add some glare because it makes everything look better. Add a glare node, fog glow. We want to turn up the size a little. Alright, and now let's animate this. So you want to go and pick a good file location. Don't save it to your temporary files, that's a bad idea. And then we go to render animation. Oh yeah, another one. Now, I'm going to stop this. So we don't actually need to render it with such a high quality. You might want to turn this down a little bit. Or another thing we can do is under performance. Oh, sorry, under sampling. Okay, so you might want to turn this down a little bit. This is useful for like interior scenes or anything where you have light bounces, but since all of our particles are emissive and don't actually either cast shadows or, receive shadows or reflections, that's not really necessary. And another thing we can do to speed this up is we can actually bake it. So you need to save your scene to be able to bake something. But when you do that, and have the particles render properly and faster because now our computer has saved where all the positions are and it doesn't have to generate them dynamically. Let's just take a look at this frame. Okay, and that's looking pretty cool. So let's render the whole animation. And I will check back with you guys as soon as this finishes. Okay, so it's done rendering, and we can take a look right now. If we just go to Render, View Animation. Okay, and that looks pretty cool. Now, the cool thing about this is that we can also duplicate it. So we can make another emitter. And if you want the firework to be smaller, we can, you need to delete the bake, by the way, so you can actually change these properties. You can reduce the normal velocity so it doesn't expand as far. Oh, right, and you also need to disconnect these two, otherwise they'll be the same. So there was a 2 there, just click it, and now you can see they have different names. We're going to up this back to 6. We'll change this to 3. My computer's pretty good, so it can handle this, but if yours is not, you might not want to risk it because I don't know, melt the GPU. Careful. So we can move these around in space. I'm going to move them a bit lower down, and I'm going to make them different colors. So we can select one of them. So let's take a look at the... Okay, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create a couple of different spark materials. So we're going to have to duplicate the spark object. So we'll call this spark001 is fine. And we're going to click this to make an individual material. And now we can change, all we have to do is change these colors. So let's say green to like a bluish, and we'll make another one. So do the same thing, like that. This one will be pink. To brighter pink maybe, like a violet. Alright, now, so we need to take, now we need to reassign these. Oh, and my computer is starting to slow down. Oh boy. So we are going to reassign these, so we're going to change this emitter object, and we'll have 001 go on the left. Let's go back a few frames. This is really slowing down my computer. And we'll have 002 go on the emitter to the right. There's also emitter 002. Okay, great. And now let's take a look. Now this is going to take a long time to render. I don't actually know how many particles it is, but it might be like 1 million. Okay, that's not working. Why? That's because in the particle settings, so make sure to make this one its own as well. Forgot to do that. So in this render tab, we're going to change the sparks instance to sparks 002. That. This one to sparks 001. Oops. Okay, working too well. Oh, this is so slow. Okay, here we go. So we got a couple different colors now. We can also delay the timing, so we can have this first emitter, we can have it go off at frame 21 and end at frame 24. And we can have the second emitter come off a little bit after, so let's say 43 to 43. Okay, this is what happens when you use an experimental build. So we're going to change that one first. 43 because we can't have the starting time after the end time. Okay, great. So now we're going to use up the whole sort of frame length, and we'll change this whole time thing to 100, and we can actually start this at frame like 15, I guess, because we don't really have anything interesting going on before then, and we can see how these are like delayed. Okay, great. So now we have 3 different fireworks. And since our camera focus is on the central one, these two will be a little bit more out of focus. So that's a cool effect, I guess. And let's set this to render again. I'm going to put this in a slightly different... And I'm going to render this at a lower resolution for now. I can do the high-res one later. And let's see what it looks like for us with all of them going off. Pretty cool. Another effect you could add is if we go into the, I don't know what this is, color management, we can change the view transform to mic and change sort of contrast, I guess. You can play around with the color management, do some pretty interesting things. I'm going to turn this down a little bit more. 16. You can change the exposure if you think it's a little too bright or too dark. Or that might not actually do much because all we have is super bright and super dark. Yeah, that's about it. You could, if you wanted to, you could try to reduce the noise a little bit with the denoising. So we can actually take a look at how that would make a slight difference. Although it's going to take a little bit longer as well. Or maybe a lot longer because we have a lot of geometry in this scene. Almost there. Okay, so now if we look at the difference, you can see this is a little bit more noisy. That's kind of okay, and the denoising also leaves a few artifacts like those. So you might just want to leave it off. Anyways, now to render the whole animation, and I will see you when this is all done. So here are another few renders I've made, and I hope you learned something from this video and enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.